So in lesson 1 of part 2, we had a look at about how Keats is establishing part 2 of the narrative in order to make the reader fully aware that this happiness between this so complete a pair cannot last. There will be a fall from grace, which we expect in all tragic stories. And we ended our section looking at that line that a moment's thought is a passion's passing bell. The fact that Lycius is aware of the outside world, his brain is now thinking he's going beyond the idyll that she has set up for him, and she is acutely aware that this is the death bell for their relationship. And we briefly mentioned about in any tragedy, we looked at this idea of kind of the self-destruction versus fate. And certainly in this next part of the narrative, we'll be looking at the choices, the decisions that particularly Lycius is making, which leads to the destruction of the pair. So that's going to be the focus of our annotation and the sections that we're looking at today. When you get to slides with the poem on, every time pause the video, take some time to read through that section, and maybe read it through a couple of times, and then restart the video so you can hear my thoughts on key moments of those extracts to help you annotate your anthology. So carrying on from where we finished at the end of last lesson, this is the section that you will have read now, and I'll start to talk you through it. I've colour-coded it red and blue, essentially so you can see the dialogue that Keats affords the two characters. Lamia is the blue, Lycius is the red, and I think it's really important that you start to have a look at the weight of dialogue afforded to these two characters, because certainly as part 2 progresses, the use of dialogue tells us an awful lot about what is happening to Lamia. So I would really notice that and pick different colours to box out the dialogue of the two characters, and then later on Apollonius when he starts to join in the narrative. So here we have the voices of the two characters. We're brought really close to them because we actually hear now. We've not got the narrator telling us. He's given us this first-hand view of the conversation between the pair. Lycius is absolutely aware that Lamia is unhappy, and she replies, but tenderly, and that's an interesting word for her there. And she feels that she has been deserted. He has lost sight of her. She has been dismissed. Remember, he's still physically there, but his mind is elsewhere, and she feels that even that, with him not thinking about her 100% of the time, that she is now lost to him. And she is resigned to that. It must be so. This was inevitably going to happen. So she seems to understand the nature of relationships and how they work, and actually that time inevitably will erode the feelings that people have for one another. Lycius's response, however, is particularly interesting. You might debate whether it's very possessive, whether it's very patronising, whether it's just incredibly romantic. The jury's out on that, and I'll let you decide what it is. But I'm particularly interested in how he talks about Lamia and what she means to him. So he's kind of can't believe that she's worried about the fact that he doesn't care for her anymore. What mortal, what kind of man? That's him, who else has a prize that I have got? And I'm really interested in the fact that he sees Lamia as his prize, that, he has won something with her. Remember, our very first image of Lycius was him in that chariot race. He was foremost in the envious race. This is a man who lives in a very masculine world, a man of competition and rivalry. That's kind of what Corinth represents. And in the race, when we first meet him, he is, the envy of his fellow competitors. He is foremost, he is first. And here, that envy, he wants to continue. He wants them to be amazed by him for the beauty of the wife that he's got. It is this which is forcing him to leave behind that erotic idyll and make the decisions that he does. He wants to go out into the streets. He wants to triumph in what he has won. He wants to rejoice in the fact that the rest of Corinth will just be either choking with envy or shouting in amazement. And he expects the streets to be thronged, watching the bridal passage, watching her go through the city. This is a man whose pride is absolutely taking control here. I guess we could talk about his hubris, his excessive pride. And it's a very foolish and a very flawed human desire. He wants the envy of others and doesn't understand, unlike Lamia does, that in doing so he will destroy the very thing that he wants them envious for. And perhaps Keats, or certainly some of Keats's readers, would be very aware of that tension between the pride that Lycius has and how destructive him showing her off to the world will be. William Hazlitt is a contemporary of Keats. He was a satirist and a social commentator. This is a line from one of his many pieces of literature and writing. But he does talk about how envy will put an end to whatever it is that gives pleasure. And that's absolutely what we get in this poem, the envy that Lycius wants to instill in others, and later on the hate that Apollonius directs towards Lamia absolutely does give an end to pleasure. And Keats is certainly exploring this idea throughout part 2 of the poem. So that's the end of the dialogue between the pair, and then the narrator takes over. Remember that omniscient, all-seeing narrator, and he tells us the reaction of the couple after this dialogue. Look at Lamia. She's not named here, she's the lady, which I think is important for Keats to be stressing at this moment. We are seeing her as a woman and nothing else. And she is absolutely a victim. She trembles. She's silent. She's pale. She's meek. She then gets on her knees before him and weeps. Absolutely weeps away, in that kind of metaphor there shows the extent of her sorrow. She beseeches him. She's pleading and hanging on to him. She wants him to change his mind. So he's got absolute control over her here, and she is desperate to change his mind, and her physical actions really show a very, very different type of Lamia character than we've had in part 1 of the poem. She is, despite her victim status, however, far more clear-sighted than Lycius. She understands that his decision is going to be their downfall, and he doesn't see this. So she occupies an interesting position here. She is both victim, but she is also very clear-sighted and far more knowledgeable than Lycius of the effects of the decisions that he is making. But remember, our tragic hero, and Lycius could be our tragic hero here, his downfall is due to faulty judgment and errors of judgment, and we absolutely see this being set up by Lamia's reaction. This is also emphasised by his reaction to her. So when he sees her absolutely devastated, these few lines here take us through how then he responds. And actually, he takes delight in this. He takes delight in seeing her sadness and her sorrow and her suffering. Because, and this is where my image comes in, his passion, his feelings for her grow cruel, which is an interesting description because they seem to be contradictory from one another. But essentially, in seeing her feelings towards him, that gives him some pride. But then also, it gives him an opportunity to tame her. He talks about the two contrasting sides of her character, which we absolutely get throughout this poem, her wild side, but then her timid and her submissive side. And he wants to be able to tame her to his aim, to his purpose. So this is kind of almost like red rag to the bull here. He wants to take control of Lamia. He wants to get her to submit to his will, and therefore his passion grows cruel. He will do whatever it takes to get her to agree with him. And the narrative continues with Keats again giving us a further warning. He goes back to what he does best and refers back to Greek and Roman mythology. And here he uses this simile to talk about the fury of Lycius at this moment, the fact that she's not submitting yet and he's determined to make her. And he describes his behaviour like that of the god Apollo, and how he went about killing the serpent in one of the Greek myths, and the kind of the ferocity that he would need to tame the wild beast. Apollo is exactly the same ferocity that Lycius needs. And I think it's really interesting that Keats talks about Apollo killing the serpent, because obviously that is a reminder of Lamia's background. However, remember, she is the lady in this part of the poem, and Keats is really keen to stress the kind of the irony of Lycius's behaviour here. Apollo kills the serpent, Lycius is going to kill the serpent, but crucially, and the narrator directly intrudes here, serpent, she certainly was none. So he's reminding us now that she is very human, and the folly of Lycius's behaviour is made very clear here. However, what I find really uncomfortable, and I think many a feminist critic would, is her reaction to all of this. She burns, she loves the tyranny, so the crueler he is to her, the more she seems to enjoy it, which will sit very uncomfortably, I think, for a modern reader and a modern female reader. And ultimately, she is subdued to him. It says it there, he does win, he does tame her, and she consents to marry. And we've heard of the old adage, treat them mean to keep them keen, and that's certainly what Lycius is doing here. But I must admit, and I've said it several times before, for a feminist reader, it is a very questionable decision, and again, kind of the foolishness and the hubris of Lycius is absolutely coming through here. He doesn't realise what a good deal he's got really with her. So your wedding day, supposedly the happiest day of your life, and all of the busy planning that would go in preparation for it. And Keats gives us an insight into this, but a very different insight into in the next part of the narrative presented here. So she now has agreed to marry him. But let's have a look at the dialogue that following evening. Again, the same colours. Lycius is in the red and Lamia is in the blue. Lycius is away, starts by speaking, and I find this staggering. He asks her name. He doesn't know it. Has thou a mortal name to fit this dazzling flame? He's aware that she's kind of, ironically, she isn't mortal, or she hasn't been mortal, and because she's so beautiful, he thinks she is not of this world. But he wants to name her, and I think this is really important and links us back to this image that we looked at last lesson. This is the rational Lycius coming through. The beauty, the dazzling frame, and he wants to pin down to a name. We won't talk about the fact that he's been with her in this purple palace of sweet sin and has never known her name. We'll ignore that and gloss over that. But this is an interesting moment about the rational Lycius wanting to measure, wanting to name, wanting to pin down, wanting to define. And we know exactly what Keats thinks about that. Lamia's response is very interesting because she ignores that question. She doesn't pin herself down. But then she tells us a little bit about her isolation. And again, we know that that's a key tragic concerns. Her parents are dead and buried. She has no friends. She doesn't know anybody save herself. And she says anybody that she might have known she has neglected for him. So she spent her time with him and nobody else. So she is completely isolated in this world. She does say, however, he can invite as many people as he wants. However, one request and one request only. And this sets up the rest of the narrative. Do not bid old Apollonius from me. Him keep me hid. Apollonius is absolutely not welcome at this wedding. So that's made very clear, and I think at this moment the reader will be thinking, we know exactly what's going to happen. He's going to appear. But it is, as I say, kind of setting us up for that narrative climax. We are waiting for this moment when these three people are brought together by the narrative. We know that this is absolutely going to happen. And then finally, his response to this, again, the narrator now takes over. He doesn't really understand. Her words to him are blind and blank. He has no comprehension of why she might fear this man. Again, these two worlds do not sit together. And her, I think this is quite interesting, he turns to sort of touch her and cuddle her. She shrinks away from him, pretends to be asleep. This sounds like a really old married couple who have got serious problems. And he goes to sleep. So that, it's the idea about, they're growing apart is presented physically here. This is a couple who have been so perfect a pair, so close together. And now she is shrinking away from him. She pretends to be asleep. And he does go to sleep and doesn't push this matter any further. We have a gap now being created between them. So at the end of this section of the narrative, Keats has absolutely set up the reader for that climactic moment, that moment where Apollonius comes back into the narrative. He's been presented previously and he does present a threat. The threat is still there. However, before we move on to that, I just want you to pull together your understanding so far. We've looked at Lamia in the opening of part 2 and how she started to change, and we've referenced it here. Now, how would you describe Lycius? Because he is changing too. I think the pair are almost changing roles. I would like you to write your thoughts on Lycius's character. I've given you a series of 7 words here to try and include in that discussion, or at least have something to say about those 7 words in relation to your piece of writing. That could be a clear paragraph. It might be that you bullet point your ideas under each of these as a separate heading. That choice is entirely yours. but an opportunity just to consolidate your understanding of his character so far before we move on.